Senator Whitehouse, welcome back to the program. Tell us, where did this scheme begin?
Well, I would say two things converged. One was an early plan by an attorney named Lewis Powell, who very immediately after this went on to the Supreme Court himself as a justice to convince the United States Chamber of Commerce that it needed to be much more politically active, and that part of that political activity was to exert more control over the Supreme Court because it was a place for social and economic change. And at the same time, you had a sort of tobacco health denial group that morphed into a climate denial group, where there were lots of front groups and hidden money and fakery designed to try to first protect the tobacco industry and then protect the fossil fuel industry. And at some point, some rascal figured out that you could take that apparatus that had done tobacco and climate denial and actually use it to try to capture the court, the Supreme Court in particular, so that you can run it basically the way in the bad old days the railroads used to run the railroad commissions that were supposed to supervise them.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. And by the way, happy birthday. I heard it's your birthday today. So to what extent is this capture? Well, actually, let me change that question. There's a lot of discussion about the Federalist Society and Leonard Leo, who recently made off with over $1 billion from a donor. To what extent did the Federalist Society emerge out of the Powell Memo of 1971, or did it come about on its own? And how has what role has it played in the scheme?
The Federalist Society has had several roles. One has been to be a forum where conservative-leaning law students can get together in law schools around the country, totally legit, and also to provide that as a feeder group into court clerkships and so forth, also generally legit, and then to be a Washington think tank spouting conservative opinions and views, and to the extent that Washington think tanks are legitimate, so are they. But where it got really smelly was where the Federalist Society became the forum in whose precincts big special interests got together and through some secret process that the Federalist Society has never disclosed, created lists of who was acceptable to them to be on the Supreme Court, and also, I believe, guided who the actual nominee would be in the Trump White House. So it worked very hard to fend off Justice Garland and then to put on Justice Gorsuch and Kavanaugh and Barrett. And it wasn't just that it was happening in a back room at the Federalist Society and we don't know who was in that back room. It was also that huge amounts of money, in the millions and millions of dollars in anonymous donations, was pouring into the Federalist Society at the same time.
You write about the doctrine factory in your book, The Scheme, yep. how the right wing used dark money to capture the Supreme Court. We're speaking with Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. And that back in the 60s and 70s, even the Supreme Court wasn't taking the Second Amendment, for example, is just one example, wasn't taking the Second Amendment to mean that everybody should be able to have a gun. I mean, it was an uncontroversial thing that the Second Amendment was basically an anachronism. It was left over from the debates of the founding era about whether or not we should have a standing army during times of peace, and those debates were pretty much ended by the invasion of the British in the War of 1812. When Jefferson had collapsed our army from 300,000 people down to 6,000 people, and then the British just kind of walked in, And then I believe it was in the mid-1970s, my recollection is 1978, there was this article in the Rifleman, the NRA magazine, about how, no, the Second Amendment was so people could protect themselves. And this turned into this huge campaign by the NRA, and now you've got, the Supreme Court fully embracing completely brand new theories. How does this come about?
It comes out through a combination of doctrine promotion. So you cook up these theories in academic or pseudo-academic venues and propound them as if they were real doctrine. And then you amplify it like crazy in conferences. And the Federalist Society was a very good amplifier of a lot of this cooked up doctrine. And then you try to plant people on the court who will take that stuff as serious thinking and move it from the secret money funded doctrine factory into the law of the land. To your point about the Second Amendment and whether it contemplates an individual right to bear arms, there was actually I believe, Republican appointed Supreme Court Chief Justice not long ago who said that that notion was not just not accurate, it was a fraud, he said.
That's right.
It was a fraud on the public. So we've moved from the Chief Justice saying that doctrine is a fraud on the public to a majority of the court saying, hey, that's our new doctrine.
Right. It's truly remarkable. To what extent is the ability of billionaires and giant corporations now, in large part, I'm assuming, as a result of, the Buckley and Bellotti decisions and then Citizens United and whatnot, to what extent is that ability of dark money to legally buy politicians responsible for the success of the scheme, or are there other major variables that have pushed it forward?
I think it's an important part of the success of the scheme. Take a look at, for instance, the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh. When you have a person come in credibly asserting that she was molested by Kavanaugh and that he had not been truthful, that's, in an ordinary world, the kind of allegation that would make senators sit back and say, ho, wait a second. I don't want to have to deal with that. I don't want the entire sexual assault community furious with me for, disbelieving and ignoring this witness. This is a candidate who should be quietly withdrawn, and let's move on to the next one on the list.
Right.
But there was immense pressure to have everybody on the Republican side line up. And it was similar pressure to the pressure that said we all have to pretend that you can't nominate a Supreme Court justice within a year of an election and then go around themselves to confirm a Supreme Court justice within weeks of an election. So those are signs of very powerful political winds blowing. And those powerful political winds blow through dark money channels into these independent expenditures that are now often bigger than the actual political campaigns of the candidates themselves, and dump tens of millions of dollars in usually very scummy negative advertising into races. So having that political pressure behind Republican senators to choke first the phony baloney, can't confirm before an election theory, and then overlook the charges of the witness who suffered, she said, the sexual assault, and then to turn around and reverse your earlier phony baloney, not before an election theory, and stuff somebody through even sooner before an election. I don't think those things would have happened if it weren't for the dark money political influence.
Yeah. Am I remembering correctly? It was Ginsburg who withdrew his nomination because he smoked pot or something like that. That was a long time ago. In any case,
there were several withdrawn for country club memberships and having smoked pot and various things.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what's the solution for this? The Article 3, Section 2 of the Constitution says that the Congress may regulate the court and may provide exceptions to what the court may rule on. That I realize. The regulation has been largely limited to the size of the court throughout the court's history.
Yeah.
But what do you think the Senate could and the House, Congress could seriously do to put a crimp in this, on the assumption that most of this is coming out of these bizarre Supreme Court decisions?
Well,
we have just a minute left, by the way. I'm sorry. Until we hit
most important thing we could do is to get rid of this damn dark money.
Yeah.
Take it out of our politics. Treat dark money expenditures in campaigns for Supreme Court nominees as political campaign advertising and let the public know who's behind all that nonsense.
Do you think Congress has the ability or the will to do this? And how would they do it?
Unfortunately, a Republican Party that has become almost umbilically dependent on dark money is relentlessly opposing our efforts to clean dark money out of the political system.
Right, right. Well, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, you are, one of the great voices of sanity in the United States Senate, and providing such an important service. I also should note that the scheme, you've got a YouTube series on this over at youtube.com.